Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Misha Panko. Misha has worked in data for a long time, including on high-performance data teams at Uber and Google. Today, Misha is the co-founder and CEO of Motif Analytics, a product focused on helping growth and ops teams understand their event data. During this episode, we went all over the place. We nerded out about the state of the art in computational neuroscience, where Misha got his PhD. We talked about at-scale data orgs, and we went deep into how event stream data is different than classical fact and dimension data and why it needs different analytical tools. I found this episode particularly fascinating because I have personally suffered from exactly the problem that Misha and Motif are solving. Sure, it's possible to answer very specific event-based questions using common tooling and practices today, but it's hard, and it always feels like you're only scratching the surface of the questions that you could ask. The ideas we got to at the very end of the episode, where Motif is modeling event sequences using the transformer architecture, really has me very excited to play around with it. Without further ado, let's get into it. Misha, welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Tristan. I'm glad to be here.
You have a very interesting background. You've done some interesting things over the past couple of decades. Before we kind of really dig in, can you introduce our listeners to who you are, where you've been?
I'm a big fan of the show, by the way, and listen almost every other week. And I noticed that a lot of people that you have on the show have academic background. Oh, actually, there's a split, I guess, right, that I observe. And I come from the academic background. So did a PhD in computational neuroscience, a lot of machine learning, was building brain-computer interfaces and decoding signals from the brain. But then decided to go into tech, do something more practical, and worked at Coursera, Google, Uber. I was a product manager, but working very close to data and growth teams. And that's, I think, what shaped my path to starting Motif.
And you started as your role at Coursera. You were an engineer, right?
Oh, that's right. Yes. For about a year and a half, I was a product engineer. It was an interesting role because while I was doing a lot of coding, I also was able to play a product manager role for myself, as you can say.
You've got the academic background, you've got the engineering background, and then you moved into product and data, and you've seen some pretty significant scale. I mean, Uber and Google, pretty meaningful products. Before we get to the kind of meat of the episode, where we're going to talk about data, I'm very fascinated by your computational neuroscience background. Elon has made this kind of very front. I don't think that everybody in computational neuroscience is trying to create brain-computer interfaces, right? Like, what can you summarize? Like, what is the field kind of overall?
Gosh, that was a while back.
Sure.
I'm still following the field, right? And definitely Elon's work. Well, there's
are people trying to simulate the brain in whole cloth in a computer, or are they trying to interact with it? What's the goal of the field?
All of this, right?
It's
trying to figure out how the brain processes information, right? And it could be from the perspective, and used to be from the perspective of, let's try to understand how neurons and networks of neurons, right, interact in the biological tissue, right, to do the computation. Of course, that has really been not appended, I'd say, but it has a lot of connections to the modern AI, right? And how neural networks that we know for LLMs work, and how that might connect to how the brain works, right? There's a lot of more interesting work there. But there's also, like in the last several decades, was work on how can we decode the signals from the brain, because the technology became good enough with electrodes, right, to extract signals. Think EEG or implanted electrodes sometimes, to get the signals from the brain, often individual spikes, right, from individual neurons. And then if we can understand and kind of process the data, right, maybe that will give us a glimpse of how the brain actually encodes information, processes it, right? And ultimately what Elon is saying, right, obviously he's making it very popular, how we can interact with the brain directly.
Is your professional opinion, as a decade out of school, computational neuroscience, that the direction that Neuralink is taking will take us to cool places?
Yeah, very good question. It might. What's interesting, I sort of, as many of us, visit Hacker News, right, and sometimes comment. And my most popular comments are usually around when there's like a brain-computer interface article, right? And I give my opinion based on my background. So one of the reasons I actually left academia was that I deemed that it will take a decade or maybe more, right, to get to practical applications.
From then or from now?
And now my opinion hasn't changed. It's still going to be
Huh.
probably a decade, right? So it's hard to predict. You often on your podcast like, well, we can't predict that far. Let's talk about decade or maybe 5 years, right? So I still think it will be, well, maybe 5 to 10 years, maybe more. Who knows? And there's interesting reasoning there. We can talk a little bit about it if you want, or I'll happy to grab beer sometime and talk about
But
it.
it seems like there are some interesting use cases that are already starting to come out of Neuralink, but they're not the kind of things that like are going to enter the mainstream of our society anytime soon. They're like for specific people with specific maybe health problems today that it's applicable for. Is that fair?
So yeah, definitely far for mainstream, but even for this medical applications, right? That is usually what research is done for mainly. It's actually kind of hard to sponsor this research and have good reasoning for it because of many other ways that people who have even some control of their body, say like eye movement, right, residual. Well, eye trackers are very good these days. Or Stephen Hawking, right, he used his pinky, right, to type. So if you like, we are pretty good at mechanical and electrical systems these days, right? That we can make devices that help human communicate with the world without necessarily, like, through muscles, through the remaining muscle activity that they have, right? That it's hard to justify a surgery, right? An invasive surgery opening up the brain often. And that's why what's one of the big reasons why research is so slow, right? Because they're getting the approvals for good reasons, right? Is hard. And so iterating on the technology, on the electrodes is hard and slow.
Hmm. Okay, I know that we could probably spend an hour talking about this. It's certainly a very interesting area for many folks. But why don't we get into data? Can we maybe start with your experiences at Google and Uber? I think it's fair to say that the data environments at those two companies are probably atypical. If you just kind of picked a random, Fortune 1000 company out of a hat, their data experiences would be pretty meaningfully different than the ones that you had. How would you compare and contrast your experiences working in the data domain at both Google and Uber? How are they different? How are they similar?
I think you're definitely right. Right, working at Google, both Google and Uber are very large, and they have dedicated big platform teams internally that build infrastructure and tooling. Right, and so they definitely try to build first when it comes to data and many other areas and tools as well. Uber does buy externally occasionally. So there was a moment when Uber added Mixpanel, for example, where Google, I haven't seen that. Right. It's the culture of let's build everything inside is very strong, and the resources are there to do that. That might be changing though with more of the tightening of the resources, right? And that's happening across the whole industry.
So there's a general willingness to invest in platforms. How about the way that data is organized? How about culture around data? Like, do you have kind of cross pollination between these two companies in kind of how they operate?
So first of all, the stacks are very sophisticated, right? Obviously, compared to many other companies that I worked with or kind of I'm seeing now. A lot of that's why a lot of tools that we're seeing in startups in the data, right? They basically were already potentially built internally, right? And people taking them out. This is the case also with the company that we're building now. Some of the predecessors to Motif, right? Is a tooling that we were developing at Google. But yeah, there's usually hundreds of thousands of tables, right, that are in their data warehouse. Some of them are standardized, but a lot of them are ad hoc. There is obviously like trillions of events flowing, right, to populate the data, and lots of ETL pipelines. So the just organizational complexity becomes big, right? How do you find out which table is the one that out of thousands of tables that have revenue column in them is actually the right the right one to use for a specific use case, right? So those types of questions become kind of more important rather than like making sure that the data exists. It probably exists somewhere, but how do you figure out where to grab it? And then the other one is when I was working at Google in 2016-17, there was a big push toward privacy, right? And it was becoming harder and harder to get access to the data, right? You have to justify more and more. There's more teams you have to go through to get approvals. The same happened at Uber later.
What does that look like? Do you like fill out a form with some with some organization to say like here's why I need the data, and then they get back to you in 2 months? Like what does it feel like?
Usually it's faster,
Okay.
fortunately. So that yeah, you fill out the form online, and when you try to get access to a certain data set, the team gets back to you, and it's just a number of questions that you hear back of like justify it for me, right? Or get me a director to sign off here.
Yeah, you need like some senior level person in your reporting structure to okay the request, something like that.
Exactly, yes. More and more of that.
Let me sharpen my question up a little bit, and we can start to get into the kind of motif area because I want to definitely get there. We talked about how Google and Uber are probably different in a bunch of ways than a random Fortune 1000 company, or take a much earlier stage digital native company. They're different there too. I feel like the place that value comes from in analytics is different, and I know that this is a thing that you think a lot about at Motif at many companies, and I think this is often true for both large enterprises as well as earlier stage digital natives. A lot of the value from analytics is just let me know the answer to some basic questions about the state of my business. And even when questions are more exploratory, they are fairly simple to reason about. Let me understand the churn rate of this segment versus this segment, where those two segments are defined by the number of employees that customer has, something like that. And when you're at a kind of, maybe let me just call it for a second, a typical company, this is where most of the analytical value is derived. And it's like, how quickly can you answer those questions? How many people in the organization have access to answer those kinds of questions? These are what differentiate companies. But I think that when you're at a like hyperscale digital native company, a lot of the value in analytics comes from this like very different type of data exploration because the revenue opportunities that come from that type of exploration are very real. Am I in line with like how you're thinking about this?
I think you might be surprised. I was surprised when I went to Google and then Uber, how much of it is similar to smaller companies when it comes to where the value comes from, right? In analytics specifically. Of course, there's a big difference in machine learning, right?
Sure,
Because
totally.
they take data off and spin off machine learning models and put directly into the product, right? But when it comes to analytics, lots of it is still about just getting basic facts and getting them to the decision makers when they are asking for it. So the very typical loop is product manager, right, working next to an analyst or data scientist, and the product manager keeps asking questions, right, for a deck. Or to help analyze the experiment, or to for some dashboard, right? Or just a custom question. So that is in my experience the bulk in almost any company. Like at Coursera, it was at Google, at Uber. That's what I'm seeing among the customers of Motif, right, and all the different people I talk to as well.
Go into Motif a little bit because my understanding is that at Motif you're significantly less focused on that type of analytical flow and much more focused on a type of exploratory analytics that is very event stream based and helps you optimize the flow of customers through like large scale digital systems.
Here's how I often think about. I've been thinking about this a lot, right? As I was a product manager on data platform teams, serving internally a lot of different growth teams and product teams, and often I needed to help frame analytics, right? So how we approach analytics. One of the best lenses that I found was talking about analytics as a pyramid, right, of three steps. At the bottom first, when you establish analytics, people want to answer what questions, right? This is what I think of reporting usually. They want to just know how many users are there on our platform, right? What's the revenue? They want to build dashboards and monitor that, right? That's like bread and butter of analytics that we usually think about. But what is the kind of like North Star or the holy grail, right, of analytics. As I had a conversation with Ben Stencil about it, and that's kind of what we're talking about, holy grail of analytics, is to actually guide decisions, right, in business.
To guide decisions, you need to answer why questions and not what questions.
Exactly, right. If you like really think about it, it's more about, so if I didn't have this data, right, would I make a different decision about, say, launching this feature versus that feature, or expanding into this v- uh, location, right, versus like country versus that country? Like, I would probably make a decision some way, right, based on hunches, based on my mental model of the business. But if I have data coming in, can it influence and change my decision? Right. That's where like the real value comes. Now, and when you start thinking about those types of questions, they are rarely just give me a number, right? Give me a count of something. They are more about why, right? So the next level of the pyramid is answering the why questions or root causing, right? So why I'm looking at my metrics. Why did it suddenly go down? Right.
Hmm.
That everybody probably knows this, right? Every working with data, every other week you'll have executive or product manager run to you and say, "Oh, we're seeing this weird trend. What is happening?" And you have to look into it, right? But then finally, the top level. I'm still looking for a right word here. I use guiding these days, right? Is like where you analytics is guiding, and that is answering the how question, right? Now, I don't want to just understand why metrics are moving. I want to understand how I can move my metrics in the direction that I want, right? And so it goes from what to why to how, but it's always a pyramid. What I've seen, you can't come into organization and say like, let's just start guiding, because first you need to get the bottom layer down, right? And that's where I see 80% of the companies are, right? They are still building that foundation, and that's where a lot of like data and data tooling work is, right, helping with that. And yeah, I've seen that there's a lot of already companies in this space, right? And in fact, like we as a field making a lot of progress there with modern data stack, right? With companies like DBT, and wanted to help with the next level, right? Of how do we take it to this why and how questions.
I've helped folks answer a lot of why questions over the years. I completely agree that when you find yourself in a situation where there's a well-formed why question and you actually have the data to answer it, it is incredibly satisfying and it can drive a tremendous amount of business value. But it's a high bar. In most data domains, my belief is you actually don't have sufficient data to answer why questions very effectively. Take some, my brain goes to healthcare, and you're a provider, you have a ton of data, but you don't observe things in such fine-grained detail that you can really kind of track people's behaviors through complex interactions and say like, oh, I think I know what you're going to do next, and I can work back to a cause, whatever. Which is, I think, why oftentimes we're stuck at this, what is even happening layer, aside from kind of data maturity. And I think that you folks are primarily focused on product analytics. Is that right? Because in product analytics, like you have a tremendous amount of observability around at as fine grained of a level as you want.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that you're touching a lot of things here on here. Let me start unpacking, and then feel free to kind of, we can take it any direction. So you even use this word, the C word, causality, right? Uh, you had Sean Taylor on your podcast a couple of years ago. He's one of the co-founders, right? And he is one of the like known experts on causality, right? And we have a lot of discussions internally about that. So definitely causality is very, yeah. Ultimately, probably we're after causality, right? We want to find what drives the business, right? And causality in this way, where find me the levers that I can push that we know are causal to the KPIs and metrics that we care about as a business, right? And yeah, causality is there. Now, as you are saying, causality is very hard, right? You usually don't have enough data. You also cannot isolate like an experiment very easily, right? That's why A/B testing is the gold standard, but you can't make any decisions based on A/B tests. And so, what can you do, right? I'm a practical guy, and I help make practical decisions. PMs very often are, right? Have to be like threading the needle. And I like to think about it this way. So you have the spectrum, right, of causality. On one end, you have the total causality of A/B tests, right, and experiments. Now, that's where you can make very definitive decisions based on causality. But it's rightfully became bread and butter of how analytics needs to be run, right? To like once you become mature enough, you set up an experimentation infrastructure in your company and run experiments. But even at huge companies like Google, Uber, only a small fraction of decisions, everyday decisions, end up being made on A/B tests. And that's because it is pretty expensive to run one, right? You have to actually build the feature that you are testing, and then usually it takes anywhere from a couple weeks to a month to even in big companies to run the test, analyze the experiments, make a decision, right? So it's a slow process, right? So on that, what do we have on the other end of the spectrum? It's correlations, right? So we have an idea, maybe A influences B, like say people seeing certain feature affects them subscribing. So let's just plot the correlation, right, between the two. Unfortunately, as the mantra is, correlation is not causation, right? And there's too many correlations that exist in the data, right? So can we do something better between correlation and causation and this A/B tests, right? And this is something that we call them causal opportunities, right? Or we're still thinking of the term, or practical causality, or could be just correlations adjusted for prior behavior, right? And what it means is that you can take into account the data that you have to try to, well, in causal terms, it's like deconfound, right? Or look at other possibilities of what can explain and still say that, okay, my hypothesis of A influences B still holds, right? Given this other confounders that we can potentially have. So it's a much stronger version of correlation. It's not fully causal, but what it allows you to do is to really narrow the space, right, of potential ideas or hypotheses to work on.
Confounders are such a powerful concept. Can you give the audience who may or may not be familiar with this idea an example of like what is a typical correlation and a confounder that you might not have thought about?
So I usually use this example, and it comes from Josh Wills, and he actually wrote it on Twitter, right? So people can find it. But I think he worked at Slack one time, and he says, "Well, we were looking for different levers, right, for growth teams to improve our metrics, and we saw that if people fill out certain step during onboarding, right, then they end up becoming long-term users. And that step was number 7 at the time, right? So there's like you go through a series of steps for onboarding as you provide more information, maybe, right? Set up your team and so forth. And so somewhere later in the process, if people engaged with that instead of skipping, right, that then they become a long-term user. And the company will be successful in Slack. And so they decided the idea was, well, if there's a correlation there, let's pull it early in the process, right? So more people will see it, maybe more people will fill it out, maybe it will influence people. And then they did, right? And he said for different reasons, it took several months to do that, but eventually they did, and they tested, and behold, more people fill out that step, but the actual metric underneath of long-term engagement, right, didn't move. And then, and he says, well, the explanation is pretty easy. The people who still fill out things in step 7 when you're on board, there are people who are already predisposed, to some other reason to like Slack, right, to want to set it up fully, right? They're already ready to use.
There's some underlying characteristic that you're not able to directly observe, but it's kind of showing up in the data.
Exactly. So this is the classic, right? There's a hidden variable that actually affects both causally, right? Your A and B. And so that's why you see connection between A and B in the data correlation, but it's actually some C that affects both.
So how do you deconfound that? How do you know without the months of work that the Slack product team did there to actually show, oh crap, we can't actually move variable C, that is what you're going to find?
I wish I had Sean Taylor here with me next to me. He would do it better justice. But in general, there are statistical methods, right, to do that. Usually, you need to isolate both, or like all other variables that you're considering against, and consider them together, right, as a group, and see uh, if you consider all of them as potential independent variables, right, affecting the dependent variable that you're looking at, like how the weight's distributed between them, right? And if in the presence of this other confounder you still seeing the effect, then it's probably there, right? At least it's deconfounded against that other variable.
Got it. This is the space that Motif operates in broadly. You're trying to be this space between A/B testing, which is extremely expensive but gets you a tremendous amount of confidence around causality, and kind of general reporting, which looks at correlations but doesn't really try to make statements about causality. Can you tell me what is the actual like what is the Motif product experience? How does the thing work that people are kind of using when they use Motif?
A Motif experience is actually very different from traditional tools. And it becomes a double-edged sword, right? In the end, because we have to do a lot of education. We still don't allow people to just self-onboard. We have like superhuman, right? We have a session with them first to explain the main concept, so they after that it clicks. This is how I approach work with Motif. But what we wanted to do, there's no magic, obviously. We wanted to make the trade-offs in a different way compared to how traditional reporting tools are doing in analytics, the decisions, right? So for one, and as you start thinking deeper about it, reporting versus exploring, you'll start seeing it, right? So in reporting, you usually pre-think of the questions that could be answered, right? Oh, I want to look at the revenue by country every week, right? And so you know that question that's going to be always there, and so you can pre-compute, right, and invest a lot in preparing the dashboard. In exploring, what we wanted to unlock, you don't know questions a priori, right? You might have starting questions, but you don't know where they're going to take you, depending on what you find. And so what's critical is this fast feedback loop and ability to touch a lot of data. That's why we go to events, the regional raw events that you have, rather than standardized tables, right? Which you already have like a few pre-cleaned dimensions usually, because you want to be able to work with all the data. And also, how do you do it quick, right? Well, we basically query for a couple seconds the data to get some results, right? If you're working with a very large data set, they will be sampled. And then we use rich visualizations to show it to you. Now, based on that, you start understanding, okay, well, is it going where I need to go? Do I need to modify my query a little bit? Or maybe I'm ready now to actually query to the end, right? Query the whole data set and tighten my arrow bars, right? To get the final result. But it's a lot of this, what I'm getting at is a lot of it is about tightening the feedback loop, right? And making the trade-off so that how do I make it fast to ask the question, wait for the data to come back in visualization, then interpret it to know where do I go next, right? And this like 3-step process. Ask, compute, visualize.
And what types of questions are people asking in this interface? Is this particular types of questions? Do they use code to express them? Do they use visual experiences to express them?
So you can ask the same questions that you ask with traditional tools. So just like just metric computational questions, right? So like, how many users did action A, right, or searched, right, or how many searches per session does a user do? So you start with those questions, but sequences also allow you, and matching patterns on sequences. That's another big thing of Motif. You can start answering questions like, how often does A happen before B, right? How often do people look at this banner before they book, right, or subscribe? Uh, and you start going to this like relationships questions, right? Does A precede B? How far is it before? How many times does it happen, right? So this is becoming more of this kind of like exploring what affects what, right? Relationships. And then finally, we're working, and this is where AI comes in. I don't know if we'll have time to touch on that, to actually tighten it to say like, okay, like, is this the causal opportunity, right? Rather than just a correlation.
You have this very lengthy blog post. Was this recently that you published this?
It was you mean about the AI?
Yeah.
Modeling? Yeah, this was by Sean and Alex on his team. It was in February or March, right? So it's couple months back. Yeah.
Okay. My experience doing event stream analytics. No, okay, fine. You can do some basic stuff pretty straightforwardly, no problem. But my experience doing event stream analytics is that you're sitting in front of this pile of data, and even if you have the ultimate technical capability to traverse this data, it is actually just challenging to know what hypotheses to test for. And when I read this, and I would love for you to give kind of an intro to your thinking around AI, but I read this post as oh my goodness, finally somebody is looking at event stream data and trying to narrow my aperture as a human to say, like, okay, yes, you could actually ask infinity questions of this, but here's maybe the 15 that you should focus on to start with. Am I reading that right?
Quick stream data or like event data, right? It could be overwhelming, and you got to narrow it down. In fact, that's what we usually see, that people come to us, to Matif, right, and they want to see, like, how do I approach this, right? I kind of know that what you're doing makes sense, and I want to understand my funnels, and I want to figure out, does A affect B, but I don't know how to approach this, right? The space is too big, right? It's not as well defined. And so we have some approaches, and we're still, by the way, this is still open research area, right? That's why I think Sean is excited, because there's a lot of research work to be done here as well, right? How to approach it correctly. But here is like one path that we notice that is very helpful. So you start with what we call outcomes, right? And usually you are pretty good at telling, what do you care about in the business?
Totally.
Are you trying to grow subscriptions, hours that people spend on the platform, things like that, right? So that's your outcome. And now what I'm interested is looking at, what are some predictors, right, in the clickstream data before that outcome happens, right? Now, it's still pretty wide, the space, right? Because you can look at all the events that happened before, at all the dimensions, right, on that event, but also at any subsequences of events, right?
Right.
And the timing between and everything like that. Actually, we don't have, I think, tools to go through all of that search space, right? And figure out what matters, what doesn't. And in fact, you will need a lot of data also to statistically do it, right? We might not have just enough users, right, to be able to go through all of that. So you have to restrict it, the search space, right? And usually what people do when they go a little beyond just correlations, right, they start building like decision tree models, right, or something like that. So what you do is you extract certain features that you want to test against, say like different 5 types of events that exist, right? And then you want to test, does between them what matters, right, for my outcome. So you do this feature engineering to construct some features, and then you create like a custom model to see if they're affecting the outcome. It takes a lot of time to construct these features, right? That's usually 80% of work, not running the model, but getting the data in place. And then you're still working with very restricted space, right? So we're looking at ways how you can expand that search but still keep it under control. One way of doing it is just through exploration, right? Is giving you access to all of the events before and writing very quick the pattern to test, like, does this affect this? Like, you just go through all of your hypotheses in your head very quickly. But where AI comes in, right, is uh, is basically here, that underneath this breakthrough LLMs, right, technology and AI technology, generative AI technology that we are seeing, is this transformers, and they happen to encode sequences very well, right? We found some way, that some neural network that are very good at taking sequence data and understanding, modeling it, right, into a small embedding space, and then predicting from it, right? What we thought is, what if we take that and expand it from just using on words, of sequences of words or tokens, to using on sequences of events with dimensions? And that's what Sean and his team worked on at Matif for the last year, right? And we finally have this first feature out, and that's where the blog post came out, and we'll have a demo soon of it as well. But basically, what you do is you train your transformer based model on sequences of events, and it understands inherently the structure, which events go together, which dimensions go together or not. And then you fine tune it based on the outcome that you care about. And so now you have these annotations on all of the events that say, given the history that the user did so far, if they end up in this event, in this state, model says that there's, say, like 55% probability, right, that they're going to reach certain outcome. And this is something that you now can work with, right? You can look at which subsequences of events they lead to this like rise in the probability according to the model of reaching the outcome. That's kind of like the gist of it, right? This transformer technology, this technologies behind LLMs, they happen to be good at modeling sequences, and sort of compressing the information from sequences is just the small embedding vectors. And we are trying to use that for this use case of product analytics.
If you like this podcast, you'll love Coalesce, the analytics engineering conference built by data people for data people. Join data practitioners and leaders in Las Vegas this October. Register now at coalesce.getdbt.com for early bird tickets to save 50%. The sale ends June 17th, so don't miss out. That's coalesce.getdbt.com. We'll see you at Coalesce.
I am honestly a little bit blown away that this has taken this long to it seems when you and we'll link to the blog post in the show notes, but when you read this blog post, it feels like, oh my god, like this is what I've needed for years. Certainly there's a lot in the execution here, and I'm excited to check out the demo, but the approach seems to make so much sense. I need something that can reason about the order in which things happen to help me predict of the data that I have right now, which are the customers or entities going through these processes in my data set. How are their processes going to unfold from here? And then that allows me as business person to plug in there and say, well, what are the processes that are off track and how could I nudge them to being on track? How do I put a cherry on top of the processes that seem to be on track, maybe pull them closer to the present? But that's like the interface that I need with this data set.
I hear that you discuss AI a lot and AI and analytics, right, in your podcast recently. And I was listening on a run the other day, one of the latest podcasts that came out, and I like one thought that you had there. Basically, a lot of companies in analytics are pursuing AI or like adding AI, right, to analytics through helping them write SQL queries.
Help them do what they're already doing, but do it faster.
Right, exactly. And you had this thought that you believe, right, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's a better approach to just, instead of helping write SQL, you help working with the semantic layer, right, directly. It's sort of like more direct, right? You don't go through like intermediary steps to help with. You go directly to what you need to get to. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a true statement. I think that we as an industry are probably going to walk up a hierarchy on the AI side, and probably they're going to be and we are as a company are absolutely doing this too. But you start off with the really obvious stuff that's actually like quite easy to implement in production, and that's like, how do I do a good job of taking the thing that you're asking for and writing code to accomplish that? And I think we're going to end up as an industry finding that that's fairly straightforward. But then there's all these questions of like, well, how might we adopt AI a little more creatively in the workflow?
And we're taking that, I think, like a similar approach and saying, yeah, instead of modeling the query, right, or like writing the query for you, right, the first draft, what if you model the underlying data directly? And if it just happens that the data that we're looking at is sequences of events, right? So it lends itself well toward this kind of transformer-based architecture modeling. And if you do that, then maybe it will help you answer the questions directly. It will surface, right, things that matter, rather than like helping you sort of ask the question itself, right? And that we go into detail in the blog post about it. So yeah, if we link to it, listeners can take a look themselves.
Do you have a high level way to say like, here's how effective we found this approach to be so far?
It's still pretty early, to be honest.
Yeah.
Right. We're seeing promising results in terms of being able to go through a much larger search space, and also another big win is that you don't have to do feature engineering, right? You just put your events in, and then that's the magic of generative AI, right? You just put your things in and it just somehow figures out, right? We still don't know exactly how like what matters there in sequences. And so we're seeing that you are at least dropping the necessity to build spend a lot of time building the features for your machine for your model. And then second, that it goes through this large space, right? We're seeing some early promising results with the first customers, but it's really not time yet, and we want to write a white paper at some point, right? With the results, it's just a bit early.
Well, we'll have to reconvene once that white paper is out. I'd love to talk to you more about the results. This is maybe an excessively tactical question, but in the large language model space, if step one for every company wanting to get the benefits of a large language model was, great, go train your own model, that would be prohibitively expensive and also complex. So normally the workflows that are getting the most traction today are ones where you can use an existing model and specify a bunch of context and then whatever. Here, it sounds like you're focused on every company's event stream is different, and therefore it needs its own, I don't know what you're calling this type of model, but like the sequence model. Do you have a name for it?
Yeah, there's a GLEAM acronym.
GLEAM,
It's
GLEAM.
in that. Yeah.
If let's say that there was, you had a platform and there were a bunch of customers using this platform, did they all have their own models? And isn't that expensive? And doesn't you need to like keep training these models all the time as new events data is showing up? How does this scale?
Oh, this is a great question. This is where I definitely want to have Sean next to me talking about those, because we're exactly working on that, and his team is working on that.
Huh. Okay, cool.
But to give you some kind of rough ideas here. So one thing that we had a hypothesis, and it seems like it's panning out, is that you need much less data. It's not a large model anymore, right?
So compared to like 70 billion parameters, like we're actually talking about a lot smaller.
Exactly. And that's because the data is much more structured, right? Compared to language. Language is extremely complex. And to model it, you have to have tons and tons of data and learning. But when you look at clickstream data on visiting websites, the underlying process is less complex. So it takes less data, less training, less computational resource, right? To actually have good results on it. And so far, yes, we're training on separately for each customer on their data. But there's also this, of course, ability, right, in the future of train a model between, right, the clickstream data.
Transfer learning?
Yeah. And clickstream data between different companies, they might be similar to a big extent, right? And so there's going to be cross-pollination. We haven't touched that yet, but there is definitely there's a big difference in shape, right, of the question and of the approach that fortunately doesn't have these problems of extreme large scale of training. At least that's what we're seeing early on.
This is very exciting. Let me ask you the question that we used to end the podcast. What do you hope will be true? Not what do you fear? What do you hope will be true in the analytics space in 5 years from now?
I often think about it, obviously, as probably you are building a company, right? I hope that we move beyond the reporting. That's probably like a boring thing to say, but what I see in my experience coming to like even Google teams, Uber teams, right? Now working with a lot of different teams and companies, they're still spending most of their time, right, setting up reporting and trying to use data that way, right, for the company. And while that's necessary, I think the most interesting part comes after that. So you have your data in place, and now I want to find the best way to find practical insights out of it. I work with growth teams, right? They ask a lot of these questions in terms of why and how do I change things. And I think the answers lie in this exploring the relationships between different pieces of the data, right, rather than just counts. And I hope that the field moves more toward that, right? That we will finally leave the reporting as kind of like it's basic, right? It's there. We know how to do it. And that's where all the kind of cool action happens, right? How do we extract these practical insights that move the business, and we can answer them like on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that was kind of the promise in the field 10 years ago when data scientist first became kind of a popular job title. And then a lot of people joined the profession and found that actually, in most cases, we're not actually there. But yeah, I'm 100% with you. Misha, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs. I'm your host, Tristan Handy. Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com with comments and guest suggestions. Our producers are Jeff Fox and Dan Poppy. If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review or share with a friend. Thanks for listening.